Alrighty, so in terms of plant reproduction here, I'm not gonna take a long time here. All I'm gonna mention is regarding angiosperm reproduction. If you recall, I have mentioned this before. There's two major types of plants, two big groups of plants. There's gymnosperms, and there's also angiosperms. Okay, so gymnosperms, I'm not going to be talking about today. Gymnosperms are basically your plants that produce cones, right? And there's an entire forest, coniferous forest, right, which contain plants that exclusively produce cones. Alrighty, so those cones are they're dropped from the trees themselves, and then over time they go ahead and degrade. They lose their little, cambium tissue, the woody stuff of the cone, which releases the actual seed itself, and that becomes a new plant. Now, I'm going to go and focus most of the attention here on angiosperms. These are flowering plants. All right, so these plants produce flowers. They don't produce cones, they produce flowers. Flowers in angiosperms are the reproductive structures, as you hopefully by now know, right? So these have been a very successful group of plants evolutionarily, right? They've been in existence for over 400 million years, right? Angiosperms. It's very old. What does that mean? It means, and the implication of this is that this is a highly successful way of achieving reproduction in plants. All right, and they do so through an alternation of generation, which I'll go over in a bit. So before I go over that, here's a flower, right? Flowers have pretty basic reproductive structures here, starting with a carpel that contains a stigma, style, and ovary. Right? So stigma would be the opening to the style. The style is a canal which leads, or a tube which leads into the ovary, right? You can probably infer what the ovary does. The ovary produces the egg for the plant. Now, flowers also have a male reproductive structure, which is called the stamen. The stamen contains an anther and a filament, right? The anther and the filament produce what's going to become the pollen or the sperm for the plant, right? The microspore, if you will. Okay, so the egg and the pollen here, they are going to tend to be haploid structures, which when they come together, they make a diploid organism. All right, so these are the basic structures of flowers. There's evidently petals, right? Petals are highly pigmented, and they produce, these sugary substances, right? This nectar that attracts pollinators, right? Because otherwise, it'll be hard for the plant to, put out its pollen, right? I mean, they can use the wind, and then they do use the wind, but pollinators tend to be more successful and very, very targeted, precision-based, if you will, pollinators. Why is that? Well, because they're attracted by the nectar. They land on the petals. They go ahead and consume the nectar, and at the same time, the plant drops off its pollen on the structures of the head of the insect, right? The pollinator. So then the insect flies off to another flower, and guess what? Inadvertently, without even knowing, it drops off its pollen. The pollen falls into the stigma, follows the style, meets the egg in the ovary, and boom, you have a fruit, if you will, right? So flowers become fruits as the ultimate process of reproduction, if you will. Fruits are, sugary structures, right, that contain a lot of carbohydrates. They're very sweet, but they also contain seeds, right? So that's an evolutionary adaptation that plants evolved so that animals consume the fruit. And as they consume the fruit, they drop off the seeds either through the mouth or through the anus, right? I know it sounds kind of gross there, but as the animal consumes the fruit, right, the animal doesn't digest the seeds. The seeds pass through the digestive system of the animal, eventually becoming feces. They poop it out, if you will, and wherever they happen to have done that, the seed manages to germinate and produce another plant, right? You probably knew that animal feces is a pretty good fertilizer, right? Over time, that is. It does degrade, it breaks down, and it becomes fertilizer for plants, nutrients for plants. All right, so moving on here again, this is the angiosperm alternation of generations, which is essentially a cycle that goes from haploid stages to diploid stages in plants. We have something very similar to this. But plants do it in a different manner than animals, evidently, right? So whatever you see in red, that's the diploid stage of the plant. Whatever you see in blue, that's the haploid stage of the plant. So here's the legend right there. Let me remind you what haploid and diploid means. We saw this in genetics. A haploid means having one set of chromosomes. Diploid means having two sets of chromosomes. So in making an offspring, you want a diploid offspring, right? So therefore, in order to achieve that, then you're gonna have to have that little microspore, which is the pollen, meet the egg at some point, meet the egg in the ovary of the plant, and that is done through pollination, right? Or pollination through either pollinator or the wind. As soon as that happens, then those two microspore and egg haploid cells become a diploid structure, giving rise to a diploid organism, which can grow by mitosis, right? So hopefully you can see the relationship between plant alternation generations and how animals also undergo some type of alternation generation, right? Now, the egg and the sperm are not released, at least not in mammals. They're not released into the atmosphere like they are in plants. Matter of fact, if you release them into the atmosphere, then you reduce the viability of the egg and the sperm, right? Even though nowadays we have all sorts of experimental tools that can help eggs and sperm survive in a lab setting, and you can even inseminate and all that good stuff. But that's another story, right? The main point is that egg and sperm have to meet. Those are haploid. They meet to make a diploid organism, and therefore that gives rise to, to a new plant in this case. So real quick about fruit structure here. Lastly, there's three major types of fruit. So there are simple fruits that develop from a single flower. Right? Fruits were flowers at one point. There's aggregate fruits that develop from a single flower with many separate carpels. Right? Keep in mind what a carpel is. Carpel is the reproductive structure, female reproductive structure of the plant. So many carpels, one flower. And then there's multiple fruits that develop from many different flowers, such as this pineapple. Right? Look at all the flowers here. And those flowers have many different carpels. So all of them aggregating together, collaborating, if you will, makes up this pineapple right there. Okay, so three types of fruits, and here's a little animation on fruit structure.
Most of the food we eat is produced by flowering plants. The staples of human diets, grains such as wheat, corn, and rice, are the fruits of flowering plants or angiosperms. To understand the biology of fruit, it's necessary to study the flower. Can you make a connection between the flower parts and the parts of the fruit they will eventually become? The ovary is the part of the carpel that contains the ovules. After fertilization occurs in angiosperms, the ovary wall develops into a protective structure called the pericarp or fruit wall, which encloses the seeds and may aid in their dispersal. Together, the pericarp and seeds inside comprise a fruit. Fruits can be dry like nuts or fleshy like cherries and peaches. The fertilized ovule includes the zygote, formed by fusion of sperm and egg, and the triploid endosperm cell, formed by the fusion of two polar nuclei with a sperm cell. The fertilized ovule develops into the seed, with the zygote becoming the embryo or developing plant, and the endosperm cell becoming the nutritive endosperm tissue. The characteristics of the endosperm vary by plant species. It may contain large amounts of starch, as in rice and corn, oils, as in peanuts, or proteins, as in beans. The outermost layers of the ovule develop into a protective seed coat. The seed coat may be thin and papery or thick and hard.
Alrighty, so all that fruit structure, keep in mind again, the animal. Like us, for example, we consume the fruit. At least most of us release. I don't like to consume the actual seed itself. I love the fruit, but not the seed itself, right? But other animals, like other mammals, some of them do consume that seed, and eventually they just kind of release it as waste, which is very helpful for the plant.